Hi, I'm Anand Patel, and today I'm joined by Jonathan Aubrey-Smith and Paul Hyam from WTW's consulting practice. Welcome, gentlemen. Today I want to start by talking about the MGA market. We've seen booming growth within the MGA market. Global premiums have now hit $110 billion with over $90 billion in the US. And that's in the face of particular headwinds where the low-cost funding model that was previously driving insurtechs has now dried up or has appeared to dry up. And we've also seen a hard market that's been present. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts in terms of what's driving this growth given those particular challenges.
I think it's a great question. I think there's sort of two or three things that come out in that. Firstly, I think with the hardening of the market over the last few years, insurers have been taking the opportunity to try and expand their footprints, and delegated authority is a great way of doing that and a relatively low cost, internal cost to the insurer. I think there's a realization when you take the insurtech piece where a lot of them were focused on fixing specific problems. They didn't necessarily always target making better underwriting decisions, which I think is why that's plateaued, but I think it will come back again as people begin to realize that there's much more power they can get into the underwriting decisions. They can make better underwriting choices for their capital providers. And I think it also just comes back to a market where people are looking for opportunities to set up on their own. I think insurance, particularly in London, has always been very entrepreneurial. Setting up an insurance company on a standalone basis is phenomenally expensive. Setting up an MGA becomes much more doable. And I think people use it as a route to use their entrepreneurial skills to start new businesses.
Yeah, Jonathan, I'd agree with most of that. I think the drive towards the hardening of the market over the last couple of years has really driven a different dynamic in terms of the degrees of delegating authority. So you can see that prices are at their peak. You can see a drive towards insurers looking to expand their portfolios, and delegated arrangements can be a really good opportunity to do that. So there's also the drive towards insurtechs, as you mentioned, Jonathan, and the ongoing drive to improve customer service. So a drive to have decision-making as close to the customer as possible, I think is also a dynamic which is growing the world of delegated authorities. I think from an insurer perspective, having so many opportunities to grow, it's so important for an insurer to make sure that where they delegate the authority, where they give their pen away, is clearly in line with their underwriting strategy and their business strategy. So are you delegating authority so that you can access expertise you don't have in your organization? Are you delegating authority so that you can expand distribution to customer bases you can't otherwise access? Or are you doing it so you can expand your portfolio rapidly and at a lower cost base? I think making sure that those three things are in an insurer's mind as to where they delegate authority is hugely important.
And I think that's a really good point in terms of MGAs really having a particular USP. We've definitely seen that the MGAs which are successful are the ones that have a specific niche or a specific USP to have a particular offering. What I'm interested to kind of pick up on is you made a point around the correlation between the hard market and the growth within the MGA market. Quite often we hear the contrary, that actually as a consequence of the hard market, insurers are looking at bringing back some of that underwriting into their own practices. And therefore I'm really interested to see actually, as we now approach a soft market, will we see some of that unwind going forwards?
I think it's about stages, because I think that reshoring happens as the market hardens. I think then you get to the point, I think particularly in the last sort of year and a half, 2 years, where the market particularly in London, has been looking at each other going, the ratings is about as good as it's going to get for a long time. And the conversation of how quickly can we fill our premium coffers, how can we actually grow now, I think has driven some of that thought process. I think but you're absolutely right, in the drive to control and bring a hardening market, that there is that reduction in delegated authority, but I think it ebbs and flows in reflection to what insurers' goals are. For the preceding, most of the 2010s, it was a focus on trying to get back to a position or manage your profitability, control, and therefore the enthusiasm was more limited in some places. Don't get me wrong, it was enthusiastic in others. But as we've crossed that bridge where we're now kind of topping the curve, as it were, from that hardening market, there's an element of making hay while the sun shines and bringing on as much premium as you can. I think it's then going to be an interesting piece. And the real challenge for insurers is where we go now, because that arm's length nature of a relationship with a delegated authority, even with great control systems, which some insurers have, even with a constant monitoring process, which some insurers have, you're still at risk of the cover holders going in another direction. And I think managing that downward cycle as some markets soften and being realistic about when you need to pull the plug, when you need to make material decisions, and actually having that control environment so you're thinking about that early rather than waiting for 2 or 3, 4 years down the line. We've seen some market softening and those portfolios are now beginning to look a little bit jaded, probably is a nice way of describing it.
Yeah, so I'd agree with your original point, and I think the soft market has driven some particularly difficult conversations between capacity providers and delegated authorities. So there's been, insurers have gone through a period of culling delegated authorities where they've produced challenging results as insurers look to rectify loss-making positions. Delegated authorities can be an area where results aren't always as transparent until the results are particularly poor, so you don't necessarily see the emerging trends until it's too late. That can drive some difficult decisions and difficult conversations. And I think insurers and delegated authorities have sort of come through that period. And I think you're exactly right. Now we're in a hard market, insurers can be somewhat spoiled by the opportunity to grow as they do look to take advantage of an increased price and increased levels of profitability. So for me, that decision making also comes down to insurers maintaining their discipline and in terms of where they put their capacity and making sure it's aligned with their strategy, and taking that next step to make sure that where they do delegate authority, they're getting the right visibility and transparency of results in a partnership with that delegated authority from the offset, rather than not doing so and waiting for the ultimate reduction at the softening of the market, and therefore those challenges that can come further down the line. So it's preparing themselves to make sure insurers don't repeat the challenges of the past.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Paul, and please join us next time.